Welcome back guys, in this video we're going to be covering some advanced function concepts. You should click the info card in the top right to watch the previous video where we cover the basics of functions if you haven't seen it already. So in some ways, functions act similarly to other data types. Just like with other data types, we can store functions in variables, pass functions to functions, and have a function return a function. So first, I'm going to show you that we can store a function inside of a variable. It might sound complicated, but don't worry because I'm really going to break it down. So as you can see, I have a function named greet right here that takes a string parameter. And let's try assigning our greet function to a variable. So in my main function, I'm just going to type test := greet. And notice how we don't have brackets after greet right here. That's because if we put two brackets just like this, it means the function is going to be called. Instead, we want to refer to the function itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these brackets right here. And now let's use our test function. So let's go ahead and type test brackets right here just like this. And let's go ahead and pass it the string Alice. So I'm just going to type Alice right here. Now let's go ahead and run the code. And as you can see, our greet function right here was called. Something to note is that our test variable right here isn't actually equal to a copy of our greet function. Our test variable is equal to a reference to our greet function. That means that when we call the test function right here, it's really the greet function that's being called. And that might sound a bit confusing, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Something else we can do is make a function inside of a function. So let's try declaring our greet function inside of our main function. You might think we can just take our greet function and move it into our main function just like this. But this is actually invalid. So let's go ahead and delete this code right here since we don't need it. And then let's try calling the greet function and let's pass it the value Alice. Now let's go ahead and run the code, and as you can see we get an error. So let me show you the correct way to create a function inside of a function. So let's just move this back out here for a second. And to create our greet function in our main function, we can assign it to a variable. So in our main function, let's type greet : func brackets, and then let's just put curly brackets right here. And now let's just take this line of code from our greet function and put it in here instead. And then we can just go ahead and delete this right here. And one more thing that we need to do is put the parameter back. So I'm just going to type name string right here just like this. Now our greet variable right here is equal to this function. So let's go ahead and run the code. And as you can see, it works as expected. Now I'm going to show you guys anonymous functions. An anonymous function is a function that doesn't have a name. So let's make this greet function an anonymous function. First, let's just delete this code right here since we're not assigning this function to a variable. Now after the function, we're just going to put brackets. And let's put the string Jane inside of the brackets just like this. So what all this means is our greet function is going to be created and called immediately. And since we put Jane right here, our function is going to be passed Jane. So our name parameter right here is going to be equal to Jane. Now let's just delete this line of code right here. Now let's go ahead and run the code. And as you can see, the function was executed and passed the value Jane. And if our anonymous function returns a value, we can store it. Instead of making our function print the greeting, let's make our anonymous function return the greeting. So right here, I'm just going to type return. And then right here, instead of printf, I'm just going to put sprintf. And then let's just type string up here since we want our function to return a string. And then before my function, I'm just going to type greeting : And this is going to assign the value returned by this anonymous function into this greeting variable. So now let's just print out the greeting. So I'm just going to type fmt.println greeting. Now let's go ahead and run the code. And as you can see, our anonymous function returned a string which was assigned to our greeting variable right here. And then we just printed out the value in greeting, which is why it says hello Jane, how are you? Now I'm going to show you guys how we can pass a function to another function. This might seem really complicated at first, but don't worry because I'm going to break it down after we run our code. So as you can see, I have an add function right here, and our add function takes two ints and then returns the sum. And we also have a multiply function right here, and our multiply function takes two ints and then returns the product. Now let's make our print result function take a function. Then let's call that function and print the returned values. So right here in our print result functions brackets, I'm just going to type passed func brackets int, and then right here I'm just going to put int. Now what this is saying is that our print result function will take a function that takes two int values and returns an int. And I also want you to note that our add and multiply functions both take two ints and return an int. Inside of our print result function, I'm just going to type result : passed func brackets 10, 5. And this line of code is going to call the function passed to our print result function with values 10 and 5. And then let's just print the result. So let's just type fmt.println result. Now in our main function, let's call our print result function and pass it our add function. So I'm just going to type print result, and then in between these two brackets, I'm just going to put add. And notice how we don't have two brackets after add. That's because if we put two brackets just like this, it's going to call the add function. And we don't want to do that. We just want to reference the function itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these two brackets. And now let's go ahead and run the code. And as you can see, the sum of 10 and 5 was printed, which is 15. So what happened is we called our print result function and passed it our add function. So passed func right here was equal to our add function. Then inside of our print result function, we called our passed function right here. And we assigned its returned value to this result variable. So really what happened right here is our add function was called and passed values 10 and 5. And then right here we just print the result to the screen. Now let's try passing our print result function our multiply function instead of our add function. So I'm just going to delete add right here. And I'm just going to put multiply. Now let's go ahead and run the code again. And as you can see, the product of the two numbers was printed. And that's because the passed func variable right here is now equal to our multiply function. So I just showed you guys passing a function to a function. But we can also have a function return a function. So as you guys can see, I have an empty function right here named return function. And let's make our return function return a function that takes no parameters and returns a string. This is going to seem complicated at first, but it's going to be easy to understand once I break it down at the end. So since we're not going to have our return function take any parameters, we can leave these two brackets empty. And now we're going to specify our function's return value. Since we want to make our function return a function that takes no parameters and return a string, we're just going to type func brackets, and we're going to leave these brackets empty. And then we're just going to type string right here. So this right here is saying that we want our return function to return a function that takes no parameters and returns a string. Now inside of our return function, let's type return func brackets, and then let's just put curly brackets just like this. And then since we want the function we're returning to return a string, we just have to put string right here. And inside of this function being returned, let's just type return hello world. Now in our main function, let's call return function and assign the returned value to a variable named sumfunc. So I'm just going to type sumfunc colon equals return function. So sumfunc is going to be equal to the value returned by return function. And the value returned by return function is this function right here. So let's go ahead and call sumfunc and then store the value returned in a variable named result. So let's just type result colon equals sumfunc. And then let's just put brackets right here since we want to call the function. Now let's go ahead and print result. So I'm just going to type fmt.println result. And now we can go ahead and run the code. And as you can see, hello world was printed. So what happened is we called the function named return function right here. Then we assigned the value being returned by return function to this sumfunc variable. And the value being returned by return function is this function right here. So our sumfunc variable was equal to this function right here. So when we called our sumfunc function right here, it's really this function that's being called. And this function returns hello world. So hello world was assigned to result. Then we just printed result right here. So the last thing we're going to cover is closures. So I have some code right here that uses a closure. And I'm going to run the code and then break it down. So let's go ahead and run the code real quick. And as you can see, 1, 2, and then 3 was printed. So right here we have a function named incrementer. First, the incrementer function creates a variable named count right here and gives it a value of 0. Then the incrementer function returns a function that increases count by 1 and then returns count. Now this returned function right here is a closure. And what makes it a closure is the fact that it has access to this count variable right here even after our incrementer function is finished executing. So in our main function we call incrementer and assign the returned function to this increment variable right here. So increment is equal to this returned function. Now whenever we call increment, it's modifying the same count variable which was created when we originally called our incrementer function. So whenever this line of code is executed in our increment function, it's affecting the same count variable which was declared here. Which means every time we call increment in these lines of code right here, it's increasing the same count variable by 1 and then returning it. Which is why we get 1, 2, and then 3. In this example, the count variable was increased. I would really appreciate if you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so my subscriber count can increase as well.